You may believe attraction is mostly about desire, chemistry, and that intense spark that makes everything feel emotionally charged and fast-moving. But when it comes to an avoidant partner, those usual signals don't carry the meaning people assume they do. Physical attraction or lust might exist, but it rarely holds real influence over someone who is naturally built to protect themselves from emotional dependence. What actually pulls them in is something far quieter and more psychological. It is subtle, steady, and calm, and it moves past the defenses they normally rely on. Once you understand this, you stop trying to win them through intensity or effort, and instead begin focusing on embodying a grounded presence that naturally draws them in without pressure, performance, or force. It becomes less about chasing and more about simply being in a way that feels safe and unthreatening to their system. One of the strongest forces that captures an avoidant partner's attention is emotional self-sufficiency. Not the loud or performative version of independence, but a quiet, steady sense that you are already whole on your own. People with avoidant tendencies are extremely sensitive to emotional pressure and neediness. When they sense that someone depends on them to stabilize or complete their emotional world, their instinct is to pull back immediately. But when they encounter someone who can connect without clinging, without requiring constant reassurance, something inside them softens. Your emotional wholeness communicates safety. It signals that you are not there to consume them or trap them in responsibility for your feelings. Instead of feeling controlled or overwhelmed, they feel free. And in that freedom, they begin to move closer, not because they are being pulled, but because they no longer feel threatened by closeness. Another powerful element that draws an avoidant person in is emotional restraint paired with depth. Many people misunderstand restraint as a lack of interest, but for someone with avoidant tendencies, it creates intrigue. When your emotions are not spilled out impulsively, but are instead held with intention and felt deeply beneath the surface, it sparks curiosity. They sense that there is more to you than what is immediately visible, and that sense of mystery becomes far more engaging than open emotional intensity. Curiosity holds their attention longer than passion ever could. Lust may ignite quickly and fade just as fast, but curiosity lingers and grows. When they cannot fully decipher you right away, their mind begins to fill in the gaps, imagining and interpreting. That mental engagement slowly builds a form of attachment that reaches deeper than fleeting attraction. Perhaps the most underrated magnet for avoidant attachment is consistency without pressure. Avoidant individuals often anticipate emotional instability, sudden demands, or shifting expectations when intimacy increases. Because of that, they stay guarded. However, when they encounter someone who remains steady in tone, calm in presence, and grounded in their own emotional state, it creates a completely different experience. Your consistency does not overwhelm them, it regulates them. Predictability in this context is not boring but soothing. It allows their nervous system to relax because they are no longer bracing for emotional chaos or control. Instead of feeling pushed or cornered, they feel safe enough to stay present. Over time, this steady energy becomes more compelling than intensity ever was because it removes fear and replaces it with trust in your presence. Lust can spark excitement, but it rarely holds lasting influence for someone with avoidant tendencies. What actually affects them more deeply is steadiness. Calmness doesn't create adrenaline spikes, but it creates something far more powerful, a sense of emotional safety. For someone who is constantly prepared for emotional chaos or intensity, calm presence starts to feel strangely compelling, almost addictive. Being seen and understood without being exposed or pressured is far more impactful than raw desire. Avoidant individuals often fear being fully known because it feels like losing control. But when you observe them quietly, notice their moods, patterns, and silences without demanding explanations or forcing emotional disclosure, it creates intimacy without intrusion. Lust seeks access, but this kind of presence communicates acceptance, and acceptance feels far safer and more grounding than desire ever could. Respecting distance is another dynamic that completely shifts how attraction develops. Most people interpret space as rejection and try to close the gap immediately, often out of anxiety. But avoidant individuals experience distance differently. To them, Space is a form of emotional regulation. When you allow that space without guilt, resentment, or manipulation, it interrupts their usual expectation that distance will lead to conflict or pressure. Instead of tension, they experience relief. And when space is met with calm neutrality rather than emotional reaction, it becomes magnetic. They don't feel chased or cornered, which allows them to re-engage on their own terms. That sense of freedom, combined with emotional safety, draws them back in a way intensity or pursuit never could. Grounded confidence is another element that resonates deeply with avoidant psychology. Even without conscious awareness, they are constantly scanning for emotional power dynamics. When someone seeks reassurance, validation, or emotional stability from them, it creates subtle pressure they instinctively want to escape. But when you remain self-contained, confident, and emotionally anchored without needing approval, something shifts in their perception. They begin to see that you are not emotionally dependent on them. You are choosing yourself first. That quiet self-sufficiency signals sovereignty. And for someone who fears becoming responsible for another person's emotional well-being, that level of autonomy is deeply attractive because it removes pressure and creates emotional breathing room. Emotional neutrality during moments of tension is another overlooked but powerful factor. Avoidant individuals are highly sensitive to emotional escalation. Raised voices, dramatic reactions, or sudden emotional intensity often trigger withdrawal. But when needs are communicated calmly, clearly, and without overwhelm, it allows them to stay present instead of shutting down. Presence becomes more important than passion in these moments. Over time, this steady emotional tone builds trust in ways intensity never could. They begin to associate your presence with stability rather than pressure, which slowly deepens connection without forcing it. Calmness becomes the foundation that makes intimacy feel safe enough to exist without triggering avoidance. Finally, a rich and independent life creates a kind of psychological magnetism that cannot be faked. Avoidant individuals are not drawn to over-availability or lives that revolve entirely around the relationship. Instead, they are intrigued by lives that feel full, meaningful, and self-directed. When your world is textured with purpose, interests, and direction, it communicates that connection with you is an addition, not a burden or obligation. Lust often demands exclusivity, but avoidant psychology is more comfortable with optionality and space. When you embody that naturally, without trying to impress or chase, attachment develops organically. Emotional honesty without expectation strengthens this even further, because when you share openly without demanding comfort or validation in return, it disarms their defenses and creates a rare sense of emotional freedom they are not used to experiencing. Closeness, when it doesn't come with emotional cost or hidden pressure, completely changes how intimacy is experienced. For someone with avoidant tendencies, it challenges their usual understanding of connection. Lust alone doesn't unsettle them or reshape their patterns, but honesty without expectation does. When communication is open but not followed by demands for reassurance, validation, or immediate emotional response, it creates a different kind of emotional space. Boundaries that are clear, calm, and consistently maintained without punishment or emotional withdrawal build both attraction and safety at the same time. Avoidant individuals tend to respect limits far more than emotional pleading. When you can assert yourself without anger and follow through without turning it into conflict, it signals emotional maturity. It shows self-respect without control, and that balance removes the internal tension they usually resist. Intentional silence also plays a powerful role in this dynamic. Not the kind of silence that feels cold or punishing, but the kind that feels natural, grounded, and comfortable. Being able to share space without constantly filling it with explanations, reassurance, or emotional noise communicates stability. Lust often demands engagement, constant response, and emotional activity. Silence, on the other hand, offers peace. And for someone whose nervous system is often scanning for emotional intensity or threat, that sense of peace becomes deeply regulating. Over time, it creates space for curiosity to grow on its own, without force, pressure, or pursuit. That quietness becomes something they return to mentally because it feels safe rather than demanding. One of the strongest psychological shifts happens when you fully release the need to influence their reaction to you. The moment you stop trying to be chosen, validated, or emotionally secured by them, the entire dynamic changes. Avoidant individuals are naturally drawn to emotional self-possession. When you exist without needing their approval to feel grounded or complete, you become emotionally neutral territory. Calm, steady, and internally anchored presence communicates that you are not there to be managed or emotionally carried. Instead, you are simply there, and that lack of pressure allows them to engage without feeling trapped or responsible for your emotional state. What many people misunderstand is that avoidant individuals are not unaffected by attraction. They are affected by emotional pressure. When desire is mixed with expectation, it feels heavy and intrusive to them, which triggers withdrawal. But when presence is calm, subtle, and emotionally self-contained, it bypasses those defenses entirely. Over time, they begin to associate that presence with safety, freedom, and respect. And from that association, attachment develops in a way that is far more stable than fleeting passion. What stays with them is not intensity, but relief, curiosity, and quiet fascination. Ultimately, these patterns are not about manipulation or strategy, but about understanding emotional experience at a deeper level. Avoidant individuals don't respond to what you want from them, they respond to how they feel in your presence. When they feel safe rather than pressured, free rather than controlled, and understood without being consumed, something lasting can form. It is not excitement or emotional highs that sustain connection over time, but steadiness, safety, and calm psychological presence. And when those qualities are consistently present, they tend to outlast intensity, replacing confusion with clarity and distance with quiet, stable connection. What sits underneath all of this is something most people miss. Avoidant attachment isn't really about a lack of desire. It's about how quickly desire starts to feel like pressure. Their nervous system tends to interpret emotional intensity as a loss of autonomy, even when the intention behind it is love, interest, or closeness. So what pushes them away is rarely the person themselves, but the emotional demand they unconsciously associate with proximity. That's why the same behavior that feels bonding to one person can feel overwhelming to them. It's not logic driving it in the moment, it's a threat response shaped by past experiences of closeness, feeling unsafe, or consuming. Because of that, their attraction often develops in slower, quieter layers. They don't bond through emotional escalation. They bond through emotional consistency. When someone remains steady across different moods, distances, and moments of uncertainty, their system starts to stop bracing for impact. That's where the shift happens, not in a sudden realization, but in a gradual reduction of internal tension. The body starts to relax before the mind even labels what is happening, and that relaxation is what they begin to associate with your presence. This is also why unpredictability in emotional tone can break connections so quickly. Even small swings in intensity, from warmth to frustration to over-attachment, can reset their sense of safety. It doesn't mean they don't care. It means their tolerance for emotional volatility is lower in intimate contexts. They can handle chaos in life, but not in closeness. So what actually deepens attraction for them is not emotional performance, but emotional reliability. When they don't have to guess how you will react, they begin to stay present longer. Another layer is how they experience being understood. Most people assume that being deeply seen automatically creates intimacy, but for avoidant individuals, being seen too quickly or too intensely can feel exposing rather than connecting. What works instead is paced understanding, not rushing to interpret everything they do or feel, but allowing space for them to unfold without pressure. When someone can recognize patterns in them without trying to fix or extract explanations, it creates a rare sense of emotional safety. It feels like being witnessed without being invaded. Over time, this creates a very specific kind of attachment. It doesn't start with obsession or emotional flooding. It starts with ease, then curiosity, then trust that builds in silence rather than declaration. They begin to return not because they are pulled by intensity, but because they feel less internally defended around you than anywhere else. And that distinction is important. It's not about chasing closeness, it's about becoming a place where closeness doesn't feel like a threat. What deepens this even further is autonomy on both sides. When they see that you are not emotionally orbiting them, not waiting for responses to feel stable, not collapsing your life into the relationship, it removes the invisible weight they usually anticipate. It signals that connection is a choice, not a dependency. And choice feels safe where obligation feels suffocating. This is where interest begins to stabilize into something more enduring, because it no longer carries the emotional charge of responsibility. At its core, what actually holds their attention long term is not intensity, charm, or even compatibility in the usual sense. It's the consistent experience of emotional safety without loss of self. When closeness doesn't come at the cost of autonomy, when presence doesn't create pressure, and when understanding doesn't become intrusion, something unusual happens for them. The relationship stops activating defense, and in that space of reduced defense, attachment forms quietly, often without dramatic awareness, but with lasting emotional imprint. Another important layer in this dynamic is how avoidant individuals process emotional distance. While many people experience distance as uncertainty or rejection, avoidant attachment often interprets it as relief and regulation. This doesn't mean they don't care. It means their system resets when emotional space returns. So when someone reacts to distance with panic, chasing, or emotional escalation, it reinforces their internal belief that closeness is unstable. But when distance is met with calm acceptance, without punishment or emotional withdrawal games, it creates a very different experience. It teaches their nervous system that space is not dangerous, and connection does not collapse when breathing room exists. Over time, this reduces the urgency to escape and replaces it with a quieter willingness to stay emotionally engaged without feeling trapped. There is also a deeper psychological element tied to control. Avoidant individuals often develop a strong internal need to maintain autonomy because at some point, closeness may have felt overwhelming, unpredictable, or emotionally consuming. So in adulthood, anything that feels like emotional capture, even subtly, can trigger resistance. This is why pressure rarely works, even when it is gentle or well-intentioned. What does work is emotional non-ownership. When you are connected but not entangled, present but not dependent, engaged but not gripping, it disrupts their expectation of being emotionally responsible for someone else's stability. That disruption feels unusual to them in a good way. It creates space for interest to form without triggering the instinct to pull away. Another overlooked factor is how they evaluate emotional intensity over time. High intensity might create initial attraction, but it often registers in their system as something unsustainable. What they begin to trust instead is emotional predictability.